Hello and welcome to Roundtable. Lives and homes obliterated, and with each day the only hope for tomorrow must be to escape the horrors of today. Millions are trying to get out of Ukraine. Some have already made it. But what does the future hold? What can, indeed should, the world do to help with this mass migration? Europe has seen nothing like it since the Second World War. Getting out may be the priority, but what next for those on the move? It's very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. The borders of Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, and other countries to come, they are just a first stop. The journeys from there uncertain. There will be other countries crossed until the exodus is over. And it's not just food and shelter that are needed, longer-term schooling for the young, access to general health care. They will all have to be found. And communities across Europe and further afield will be asked to give, to help alleviate the pain that has already been felt. How much, in reality, can actually be done? We're going to head to Western Ukraine first of all, and there we see Serhiy Lukashov, who's National Director of SOS Children's Villages Ukraine, looks after orphans and foster children. In Oslo, we have Becky, Bakr, Abdulla from the Norwegian Refugee Council. Then we go to Moldova, and we see Unni Krishnan, Global Humanitarian Director of Plan International, and then to Tennessee in the United States. Jennifer Sciuba joins us. She's Professor of International Studies and Global Fellow with the Woodrow Wilson Centre. I'm going to give you some facts and figures first of all. This is where the refugees have gone. Poland taking the most so far of the displaced people, 1.7 million. That's equivalent to 3.7% of its population. Hungary and Slovakia, well, they've taken in more than 200,000. Interestingly, Belarus and Russia have also received more than 100,000 between them. More than 2.8 million refugees are thought to have fled to neighbouring countries since the 24th of February. 2.9 million, that is, of those were identified as in need of assistance in Ukraine before the recent events. Mostly they come from areas of the Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. More than 2 million people are estimated to be internally displaced in Ukraine. The figures, Serhiy, and indeed everybody, are absolutely staggering. You are working in Western Ukraine with foster children. You're trying to put children into foster care. There are orphans, more and more arriving by the day. Are you overwhelmed, or are you managing to cope?
Of course, we are overwhelmed. We are working with this problem of the internally displaced people with children since 2014, since the very beginning of the war. And we are working on the whole chain, from the front line on the eastern side, eastern border of Ukraine, to the evacuation to the central and western regions, and evacuation or relocation to the European countries. Our organization is like a chain with complex services to the children in state care, orphans. And actually, we were better prepared than other organizations to this coming crisis. We were expecting that because, as I said before, we are working in front line in Luhansk region of Ukraine for many years. And we saw that the heavy shelling, shooting at the towns along the front line where we are working began at least a week before the actual invasion. And we started to evacuate our foster families for whom we are caring in advance. And luckily, our direct beneficiaries, were safe at the moment of the full invasion of the aggressors.
Can I ask you this? The foster families, are they all in safe areas away from the shelling, or do you just not know where in Ukraine is safe at the moment?
I'm talking about small proportion of those foster families of Ukraine whom our organization were cared for. Those ones are okay and safe in Poland. We evacuate them in advance. But many tens of thousands other orphans, children in state care, now are in disaster situation. We are trying, we as many other NGOs and volunteer groups, trying to save as many as possible. And this is really a risk. On the one side, they are under bombs, under shelling, they're hiding in cellars in the battle zones, and roughly it is like a couple of hundreds of thousands of children in this situation. Okay. 85 children are already killed, at least 85, it's confirmed cases. I'm afraid the real statistic is much more worse.
I'm going to come back to you in a moment, if I may, Serhi, and ask you how you're planning to get those children who are in the worst possible situation out of the country and to safety. Thank you for now. But Uri, I want to talk to you first of all. Unni, you're just inside Moldova. It's the speed of it all, I suppose, that must be extremely worrying. It's not just the scale, the numbers, but the fact that it has just happened so rapidly. We're talking about less than 3 weeks.
Absolutely, David. In about more than close to 3 weeks, we have seen about 2.8 million people becoming refugees in neighboring countries. This is one of the fastest growth in terms of numbers. If you look at the recent history of refugee movements and humanitarian settings, as you just mentioned, I am currently in Moldova. I was at the border a couple of days ago. The border between Moldova and Ukraine is quite heartbreaking what you see there. People are arriving, mainly women are arriving in large numbers with small children, some of them with newborn babies. They are hungry, they are sick, and many of them have sustained trauma. Children have seen things which a child should never see. So of course, they need medical assistance and the obvious things such as food assistance and basic hygiene and sanitation measures. But such children also need emotional care and support. I was also in Romania before I reached Moldova. Plan International, we have teams on the ground in 3 countries, that is Poland, Romania, and Moldova. The scene is not that different what I saw in Romania, the refugee shelters or transit shelters or at the border crossings. It's not looking good, and this is one of the fastest growth we have seen. And this is a refugee crisis fast turning into a humanitarian crisis as we speak today.
Indeed. Becky, I know you've been working in Poland, and you're now back in Oslo. It's the Norwegian Refugee Council. I've been reading stories and hearing anecdotally about people who think, okay, the war's in Ukraine at the moment, but we're in Poland. It could be us next. We're in Moldova. It could be us next. We're in Latvia, etc., etc. It's not just the fear and the absolute terror of the days that these people are living through. It's fear of the future as well.
Oh, absolutely. And many of the people from the civil society in Poland, including volunteers who have been working day and night to assist refugees crossing into their borders, said that exact thing. They said, this isn't a war on Ukraine only. It's a war against Europe, and we're afraid that we might be next. And not least the fact that many Polish people have friends and even family inside Ukraine. So this is definitely now turned into a regional crisis. Like my colleague said, on day 20 of this conflict, we're seeing close to 3 million people, millions more internally displaced within Ukraine, in a senseless war.
Okay, Becky, thank you very much. The thoughts now of Filippo Grandi, who is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. How many will come? This depends very much on how the war evolves. We have a planning figure of 4 million refugees in total. These are planning figures on how many supplies you buy, how much money you put aside, so we can scale it up quite quickly. I think we may have to do it soon, because we are already at 2 million. So it's not just the sheer numbers of people there, it's what you do, Becky, with those numbers when you've got them. They've got to have schools, they've got to have health, they have to have food, they have to have clothing. Is there any way that the system can cope?
I mean, that's right. And the families, mainly women and children coming out of Ukraine now, they've spent days on the move. Some have fled by car, having to say goodbye to their husbands on the other side. Others have basically walked across the border. And once they arrive in Poland and in other neighboring countries where my colleagues are, they're in need of absolutely everything. They need warm meals, they need water, they need shelter. And most of all, they need cash assistance. They need money so that they can provide for themselves in this new life crisis that they're now a part of. Certainly, Poland, who's almost now taken in 2 million refugees in less than 3 weeks. State authorities and local governments have contacted the Norwegian Refugee Council saying that we cannot cope. We've now reached our capacity. We need help. We're not able to house any more refugees in our schools or in our sports arenas. There's no more shelter. So that's one of the main priorities for the Norwegian Refugee Council in the coming days and weeks is to provide more shelter, but not least also direct cash transfers so that these women and children can buy what they'll be needing for themselves.
Jennifer, thanks for being patient. It's not just the bullets and the bombs that they hopefully have escaped from, those that end up in these other countries, that are the biggest danger. It's also unscrupulous people who will undoubtedly want to take advantage of them, whether it be in trying to traffic the children, whether it's conning people out of the money they may have got, taking advantage of the system. How do you prevent people who are already an extremely vulnerable people being exploited even further?
I actually think that the comments that Becky made about the system are relevant here because to the extent that a system exists at all, it is a system set up for short-term displacement. And so no matter how many times we see in history and in contemporary world affairs, millions of people displaced in these sudden bursts of violence, there is an expectation baked in that this will be temporary and that we will deal with this for the short term as best we can, and then these people will go home. And so there's just not even an expectation baked into what Europe and the UK have been doing with expecting 3 years that people will be protected for 3 years and then hopefully everything will be better and they can go home. But as we see with lots of other conflicts, that's not necessarily the case. And I think that's where you're really opened up. When the system is broken, then people will work outside the system, including Ukrainians themselves are probably willing to hire smugglers, as are people from other conflicts, just for a way out.
Yeah, you called it, I think, a sunburst, as though there are these extraordinary times in human history when such big things as this happen. People are on the move, and they remain, probably, most of them, where they hopefully end up safe and well. Your book is called 8 Billion and Counting, How Sex, Death and Migration Shaped Our World. How does this compare, if you're looking at migration episodes, with anything we've seen before?
I think it fits right in there. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that policymakers seem to be surprised when these bursts happen. But how many times do you have to be surprised over and over before you realize that it's a regularity, not a surprise? And there just doesn't seem to be an incentive for the global community or even regional communities, like look at the European Union, to get together and revamp the system to deal with these long-term displacements.
Okay, Sahi, let me come to you once again. We've talked about the issue of exploitation. Do you know of many children that are already missing who you fear may be having advantage taken of?
We are in constant communication with the state partners on both sides of the border because our organization is global, and we receive the signals that there are groups and single children and groups of children, especially children from residential care institutions, that are gone missing. They were evacuated without proper documentation, without proper registration, and they disappeared. Maybe they went for good to some maybe church communities, to some charities, maybe not. They were not traced. And this is the biggest worry, biggest focus of attention for our organization, SOS Children's Villages, because we are focused on the family placement of children. We want to keep families together to prevent separation. So this is what we are dealing with. Foster families or birth families, we want to keep carers and children together. And this is what we are arranging in our process of evacuation children, from the battle zones to the safety of.
But you don't know where a lot of them are. You clearly don't know. You can't trace where many of them have gone to. They've disappeared so far.
This is a task of us as an NGO to ring a bell and to draw attention of the states. It's government responsibility, and government has resources to trace. We are just an NGO, but the state has this responsibility two states, the Ukraine and the receiving state, have this obligation to connect information, to trace the children and their families and the carers and the siblings, and to reunite them as much as possible, and to be ready to return them if, I hope it will be this possibility to return them to Ukraine. Families should be together.
The scale of the deaths so far is nothing compared to what we saw in the concentration camps of the Second World War, but I'm reminded of the difficulty people may well have in trying to trace their missing relatives, to find out how they can pull their families back together again, because nobody knows where these people have gone to. So what is the United States doing in relation to refugees? Here are some words from Joe Biden, the US president. We will make sure Ukraine has weapons to defend against an invading Russian force. We will send money and food and aid to save the Ukrainian people. And I will welcome Ukrainian refugees. We should welcome them here with open arms if they need access. Uri, are you pleased at the international reaction? So many countries saying, yes, come to us, we will help. Or do you think it is actually a little slow and a little reluctant in some cases?
If you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. That's what we see in most of the refugee settings. And of course, when you see the refugee transit centers in countries such as Romania and Moldova, you recognize how much ordinary people are stepping up and receiving them with their open hearts and opening their houses to accommodate them for a short period before the refugees start moving over. I want to touch on something which you mentioned before, especially the groups of people who are vulnerable. We know that in crisis settings such as this, and especially in this crisis, of course, everyone is affected, but there are certain groups of people who are impacted more, such as children, such as women, and especially within children, girls are particularly impacted during such crisis. They are more prone to trafficking, they are more prone to protection risks and safeguarding risks. Of course, everyone is prone to such risks, but certain groups of people are prone more to such risks. But at the same time, you might think that, well, what do you do when you have 100 things to do? From our experience, Plan International's experience of working in such settings, we believe when you have 100 things to do in a crisis setting, children are a great place to start.
And of course, so many of the men aren't allowed to leave Ukraine that when their wives, their children end up in a foreign country, they're going to be not able to protect them, and they are even more vulnerable to powerful, rich criminal forces.
Yeah, absolutely. Protection measures for children should be the number one priority in this setting. And especially there are a large number of children who are either separated or unaccompanied by their parents or their elders in the family. And we are seeing this every day at the border points and in transit centers. As you rightly said, men are not accompanying except in the rarest of rare circumstances when they are the only parent. But today, the large number of them are women and children, and many children are either unaccompanied or separated from elders. So absolutely protecting children and those safeguarding measures for children should be the number one priority, children, especially girls.
Becky, what do you do about that?
No, I completely agree with my colleague here. We know from other mass refugee crisis situations that especially women and children are the most vulnerable, and the ones that can become the biggest prey for different people with various intentions. And what we're calling for is for all parties and all involved parties to keep the protection of these extremely vulnerable groups very high on the agenda.
Would you call on the authorities in Ukraine to allow a certain number of male members of the family to leave with those female and young children groups? Do you think that would cut any ice at all?
That's certainly not for NRC to call upon, but our main concern is protection, and that goes for inside Ukraine and whilst they cross the borders. Under international humanitarian law, these groups and these persons, they are entitled to be protected, and that's exactly what we need to see happen both in neighboring countries and inside Ukraine.
Jennifer, is there a lot of ill treatment once they get away from the worst of the danger? Not just what we've talked about already, which is the trafficking and the advantage that can be taken of these people, but are they prone to being treated as second-class citizens? Or by and large, do you think they are welcomed?
What we've seen so far from media reports is that the initial reception is really positive, particularly for Ukrainians. But we have also seen some differential treatment. I'm sure we've all seen the media reports of those who are living in Ukraine from sub Saharan Africa, for example, who've tried to cross the border and have been treated differently, been treated horribly in many cases. My worry, and I think the thing for us to watch, is how long does the welcome mat stay rolled out? Because in the initial surge of humanitarian and goodwill right after the conflict that we're experiencing right now, they're treated well. But when they've been displaced for 2 or more years, particularly if the economic strains are really felt in countries like Poland that have taken in so many, I worry how long that goodwill will last.
Yeah, Serhiy, this is one of the difficulties, isn't it? The people of Ukraine are the ones at the front of all this at the moment, but because of the way that the international situation is going, all of the receiving countries, the people who live there, are going to be finding life a little bit more difficult in terms of the amount of money they have, what they are able to do in terms of coping. And are you worried that at some point people are going to say, look, enough's enough, we've done our bit, and these children will once again find themselves abandoned?
I share these worries, and the solution would be to stop this war and let people return home, and they will well readapt. We need political pressure on aggressor to stop this war. So yes, indeed, the Ukrainians being abroad for a long time could become like turn into ghettos, getting socially deprived. That's often happened to people. However, we already in Ukraine survived this crisis of refugees in 2014, when 1.5 million of Ukrainians were internally moved, and they were easily adapted in the society. So I'm still quite optimistic. Ukrainians are easily adapting, but the best solution would be to get families, get children back home. Okay. We need international support for them.
Becky, two questions. First one is, you've asked at the Norwegian Refugee Council for, I think it's around about $82 million. That equates to roughly, if we see 4 million refugees, around about $20 a head. That's really not going to go very far, is it?
No, I mean, even before this recent escalation about 3 weeks ago, the crisis in Ukraine, in the eastern parts in Donbas region, where NRC has been since 2014, was massively underfunded. And what's important to remember is that what we're seeing in Ukraine now comes after a long list of many other conflict and refugee crisis situations that we're seeing around the world. Over 80 million people today are displaced, and chronically the aid appeals that the UN and us organizational partners ask for, by donor nations, by states, are absolutely underfunded. So yes, much more money is needed in order to meet these massively growing needs. But what's needed before that, as my colleague just now said, is, we need a ceasefire. We need diplomatic pressure from European and other state and other international communities. We need a peaceful solution, and we need an immediate ceasefire to this madness.
Okay, just a quickie, and then I'm going to go to Uri for a final word, and it has to be quick, Becky. This 100,000 figure of alleged refugees who fled to Russia and Belarus, do you buy that story?
Well, I mean, we know that there are refugees in Belarus from before, right? But I'm not quite sure what you're alluding to.
Okay, it's just a figure that we read out at the top of the program. It's been put out there. We don't know whether it's propaganda or not. So you don't know. Uri, I want to come to you very quickly, if I would. We talked about money there, the lack of it. How much longer can you and other organizations working in the field, do you think, continue without enormous financial support?
Yeah, David, this will depend a lot on three things. Firstly, stopping the bombing. And unless and until that happens, the number of refugees will continue to multiply. So three things are needed. Stop the bombing, ensure unhindered access for humanitarian workers and relief supplies into Ukraine. And the third one, providing that protection and humanitarian assistance for the refugees. That's absolutely critical. But one thing is clear from the history of working in such emergency settings, as relief workers such as me or agencies such as Plan International, we have learned that this is not going to be a 100-meter sprint. This is going to be a long marathon. And it's not just the numbers. You know, I was at the one of the centers the other day where in Romania were a family of 3 people, a 7-year-old girl, her mother and grandmother, all of them displaced because of different conflicts in their lifetime. It's quite heartbreaking. So you made a point earlier that you have not seen the number of deaths, something comparable with other past settings. But we need to remember that for every refugee child we are meeting, they have a story, and that human story and suffering is not something you can compare with any other setting.
I understand. Thank you very, very much indeed. And Serhi, we saw you there, or I did anyway, with your hand on your heart. Our hearts go out to you and all Ukrainians. Much appreciated. Thank you very, very much indeed for coming on the program. I know you're all extremely busy. Thank you, wherever you happen to be, for sparing us the time to watch this edition of Roundtable. We are concentrating on events in Ukraine, giving you the background, the context behind the headlines as the bombing continues. From me, David Foster, until next time, goodbye.